He thought humiliating her would entertain the class, but he had no idea he had just stepped into a lesson he would never forget. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the Grayson Jiu-Jitsu Academy, casting long golden streaks across the polished mats as the steady rhythm of movement and quiet instruction filled the room. Students pairing off, practicing controlled techniques with focused intensity, the air carrying that familiar blend of discipline and quiet competition that defined places like this. And right at the center of it all stood Jason Miller, arms crossed, posture confident, his voice cutting through the space with practiced authority as he corrected a student's stance, his presence commanding attention the way it always did, because in this room, he was the standard everyone tried to meet, the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. And that was exactly why the moment the glass door creaked open behind him, the shift in the room was almost immediate, subtle at first, just a few glances over shoulders, a slight slowing of movement, until the quiet murmurs began to ripple outward, because standing there in the doorway was not what anyone expected, not in a place like this, not at this hour, a woman, older, easily in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple light gray sweatshirt, loose sweatpants, and a pair of worn sneakers that looked more suited for a morning walk than a martial arts class. She paused just inside the entrance, taking in the room with calm, steady eyes. Not hesitant, not impressed, just observant, as if she had stepped into a space she already understood, though nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged there. And that alone was enough to draw attention, enough to invite judgment, because places like this had unspoken rules, and she broke every single one just by standing there. Jason turned, following the direction of the stairs, his eyes landing on her with a flicker of surprise that quickly hardened into something else, something sharper, more dismissive, his gaze moving from her shoes to her posture, to the quiet way she held herself, and in that brief moment, he made a decision, the kind of decision that felt small but carried consequences he couldn't yet see. He let out a short, amused breath, just loud enough for those closest to hear, and then louder for the rest of the room. "Beginner class is on Tuesdays," he said, his tone light, but edged with unmistakable condescension. A few students chuckled, others exchanged knowing looks. The kind of shared amusement that spreads quickly when someone is singled out. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted from disciplined focus to something else entirely, something thinner, sharper, as attention narrowed in on her. Waiting, expecting, judging, but the woman didn't react the way they anticipated. She didn't flinch, didn't rush to explain herself, didn't shrink under the weight of their stares. Instead, she simply stepped forward, slow, deliberate, her sneakers soft against the mat as she moved further into the room, her eyes drifting across the pairs of students, watching their movements with quiet precision, noticing details most beginners wouldn't even recognize, her expression unchanged, calm, almost distant, as if the laughter and whispers existed somewhere far behind her. And that was the first moment something didn't quite fit, though no one noticed it yet. Not Jason, not the students, not the ones already pulling out their phones to capture what they thought might be an awkward moment worth sharing later. Because to them, this was simple, predictable, just another person who didn't understand where they were, another outsider stepping into a world that demanded proof. And Jason, with a small tilt of his head and a faint smirk that barely hid his impatience, took a step closer, already preparing to turn this into something the room would enjoy. Something quick, something harmless in his mind, unaware that every second he continued down this path, he was moving closer to a silence that would replace every laugh in the room. Jason let the silence stretch just long enough to pull every eye toward him, his presence filling the center of the mat, as if the room itself revolved around his next move. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same measured confidence, the kind that rarely got questioned inside these walls. "You looking for someone, ma'am?" he asked, though the question was not really a question, more of a statement wrapped in politeness, a way to remind her that she stood out, that she did not belong. And a few students shifted closer, their movements subtle but intentional, forming a loose semicircle that narrowed the space around her, not touching, not aggressive, but unmistakably isolating, the kind of pressure that did not need force to be felt. And still she did not rush to answer. her gaze moving calmly from one pair of students to another, watching a grip adjustment here, a stance correction there, as if she were studying rather than reacting, and that only made the room more curious, more impatient, because hesitation was expected, confusion was expected, but composure like this, quiet and steady, did not fit the role they had already assigned to her. Jason tilted his head slightly, a faint smile forming as he stepped closer, his hands resting loosely at his sides, relaxed but deliberate. This is not exactly a drop in class, he continued, his tone light, but carrying just enough edge to draw another ripple of amusement from the group. Most people start with the basics before stepping onto these mats. Someone behind him let out a soft laugh. Another voice chimed in under their breath. She probably took a wrong turn. And a few more chuckles followed, low and quick, feeding off each other, building that familiar rhythm of shared judgment, the kind that makes people feel safer standing on the same side. And through it all, she remained still. Then finally, she spoke, her voice calm, clear, without apology. I was told this was the right place, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, not defensive, not uncertain, just matter of fact, that caused a brief flicker of hesitation in one or two faces, though it passed quickly, drowned out by the stronger current of expectation. Already set in motion, Jason exhaled through his nose, amused, and glanced over his shoulder toward one of his senior students, a tall man in a black belt who had been watching quietly until now. Well, you are here, Jason said, turning back to her. But watching and doing are two very different things. His words landed with practiced ease, the kind that had shaped countless first impressions, and he gestured lightly toward the edge of the mat. You can sit over there, get a feel for how things work. The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but the tone behind it carried something else entirely, a quiet dismissal wrapped in courtesy, a way to move her out of the center without directly telling her she did not belong. A few students nodded, already expecting her to step aside, to accept the unspoken boundary, to fade into the background the way newcomers usually did, but instead, she took one small step forward, just enough to remain where she was, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady on Jason, and for a brief second, the room paused, not because of anything dramatic, but because something subtle had shifted, something almost invisible, like a line that had just been crossed without announcement. Jason's smile tightened just a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And in that moment, the atmosphere grew thinner, sharper, the quiet hum of anticipation building beneath the surface, because now it was no longer just curiosity, it was challenge. And even if no one had said the word out loud yet, everyone in that room could feel it forming, slow and certain, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Jason held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the faint smile on his face no longer as relaxed as before, and in that subtle pause, the room leaned in without realizing it, because something about her refusal to step aside had disrupted the rhythm he was used to controlling, and people like Jason noticed when control slipped, even slightly. He let out a short breath, almost a quiet chuckle, as if brushing it off, but his tone sharpened just enough when he spoke again. You sure about that? He said, tilting his head. Because once you step onto this mat, it is not a demonstration, it is training. His words carried weight now, not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate, and the students felt it, a shift from amusement to anticipation. Because this was no longer just a passing moment. This was becoming something they wanted to see unfold. A few more phones lifted discreetly, capturing angles, waiting for what they assumed would be a quick and harmless lesson in humility, and behind Jason, the tall black belt he had glanced at earlier stepped forward slightly, folding his arms, his expression curious but calm, as if observing an experiment rather than a confrontation. The woman did not move, her posture still composed, her breathing steady, and when she answered, her voice carried the same quiet certainty as before. I understand, she said, and there was no hesitation in it, none of the uncertainty that usually followed someone being challenged in a room like this. Just a simple acknowledgment, and that, more than anything, unsettled the space in a way no one could quite explain. Jason studied her for a second, longer this time, as if searching for something he could categorize, something familiar, but finding nothing that fit. And instead of stepping back, he took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel intentional, controlled. "All right," he said finally, his tone shifting again, lighter on the surface but with a clear decision underneath. "Let us make this simple." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the black belt behind him. "Ethan," he called, and the man stepped forward without hesitation, moving with the ease of someone who had done this many times before, his presence quiet but confident, the kind that did not need to prove itself loudly. Jason looked back at her, the faint smirk returning. "He will go easy," he added, and a few students laughed softly, the tension easing just enough for them to settle back into what they believed this moment was supposed to be: controlled, predictable, safe for their expectations. Ethan gave a small nod, respectful but clearly unsure what to make of the situation, his eyes flicking briefly toward her. Then back to Jason, waiting for the unspoken cue. And still, she did not react the way they anticipated. She did not question the choice, did not ask for clarification. Instead, she simply slipped off her worn sneakers and placed them neatly beside the edge of the mat, her movements slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. And as she stepped forward onto the mat, something changed again, something so subtle that it passed unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. Because in that single step, her posture shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but enough that the calm she carried now felt different, more focused, more precise. Like a lens narrowing in on its subject, Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, preparing in a casual, controlled way, still assuming the same outcome as everyone else. And Jason folded his arms again, satisfied, confident that the room would return to its usual order in just a few moments, unaware that the line between expectation and reality had already begun to blur, and that what was about to happen would not fit into any pattern they were used to seeing. The air on the mat shifted the moment both of them faced each other, not louder, not dramatic, but tighter, like something invisible had drawn every ounce of attention into a single point. Ethan adjusted his stance with practiced ease, his movements relaxed, controlled, the way someone moved when they had nothing to prove, his hands open, posture balanced, offering a respectful nod that was more habit than necessity. "Just follow my lead," he said quietly, his tone not mocking, not unkind, simply assuming, because in his world, there was always a clear difference between those who knew and those who did not, and he had already decided which side she belonged to. Around them, the room settled into a low hush, conversations fading, the faint shuffle of feet stopping one by one, until even the smallest sounds seemed to echo. Phones held steady, eyes fixed, waiting for the moment to unfold exactly as expected. Jason watched with folded arms, his expression calm, confident, already anticipating the outcome, because he had seen this before, countless times, beginners stepping in, freezing, stumbling, realizing too late that the mat demanded more than curiosity. But the woman stood still, her feet placed naturally, not wide, not rigid, simply grounded, her hands relaxed at her sides. For a brief second before rising slowly, not an imitation, not uncertain, but precise, and that was the first thing that felt different. Though most did not catch it, Ethan stepped forward lightly, initiating the movement with care, his pace measured, giving her space, expecting hesitation, expecting a delayed reaction, something to guide, something to correct, but instead, the moment he moved, she moved, not faster, not aggressive, just exactly in sync, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickered, a brief confusion crossing his face before he adjusted. Assuming it was coincidence, he shifted again, testing, a subtle change in angle, a repositioning that usually revealed inexperience, but again, she followed, matching without overreaching, without hesitation, like she had seen it before, like she understood the rhythm beneath the movement rather than the movement itself. A faint murmur rippled through the edges of the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to register. Something was not aligning with expectation. Jason's posture changed slightly, one arm lowering just a fraction as his attention sharpened, his eyes narrowing in quiet focus, because now, it was no longer about amusement. It was about control, and control was beginning to slip in ways that could not yet be explained. Ethan exhaled softly, resetting his stance, this time with more intention. His movements still composed, but no longer casual, and when he stepped in again, there was a subtle increase in precision, a quiet shift from demonstration to engagement. And still, she remained calm, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her movements minimal, efficient, almost effortless. And that was when the room truly began to notice, not because anything dramatic had happened yet, but because nothing had gone wrong for her. No stumble, no hesitation, no visible uncertainty. Just a quiet alignment with every motion that came toward her, as if she had been here before, as if this space, this rhythm, this unspoken language of movement was not foreign at all. And in that growing silence, the laughter from earlier felt distant, misplaced, replaced now by something else entirely. Something closer to disbelief, because the story they thought they were watching was no longer unfolding the way it was supposed to, and the realization, slow but undeniable, began to settle into the room like a weight no one had prepared to carry. By now, the room had completely forgotten to breathe, not in any dramatic sense, but in that quiet, collective way where no one wanted to break whatever was unfolding in front of them. Ethan circled slightly, his movements no longer casual, no longer assuming. There was a subtle tension in the way his shoulders aligned, in the way his eyes stayed locked on her now, fully present, fully aware that something about this exchange was not following the pattern he had trusted for years. And across from him, she remained exactly the same, calm, grounded, her posture relaxed but impossibly precise, as if every inch of her position had been chosen without effort. And that contrast, his growing focus against her unwavering stillness, created a silence so sharp it felt like the entire room had narrowed down to just the two of them. Jason shifted his weight slightly at the edge of the mat, one arm now lowered completely, his attention fixed, because what he was seeing no longer fit into the neat categories he relied on. There were no visible mistakes, no openings that suggested inexperience, and yet, he could not quite explain why. Ethan took a measured step forward, this time committing just a little more, not reckless, not aggressive, but intentional, testing with purpose. And in that exact moment, something changed, not loudly, not suddenly, but decisively. She moved, not faster than him, not overpowering, but earlier, as if she had anticipated the movement before it even began. Her foot adjusted with quiet precision, her balance shifting seamlessly, her hands guiding rather than forcing. And what followed was not chaos, not struggle, but a smooth redirection, subtle and controlled, so efficient it almost looked effortless. Ethan's expression shifted, not in panic, but in surprise, genuine and immediate, because for the first time, he was not leading the exchange, he was responding, adjusting, trying to recover the rhythm he had lost in a single moment he did not fully understand. A faint sound escaped from somewhere in the room, not a word, not quite a gasp, just a small break in the silence that quickly disappeared again, replaced by something heavier, something closer to disbelief. Jason straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing, the confidence that had once defined his stance now replaced by something more analytical, more cautious, because now he could see it, not clearly yet, but enough to know that this was no longer a simple demonstration. Ethan shifted again, attempting to regain control, his movements sharper now, more focused, but each time he adjusted, she was already there, matching, redirecting, never rushing, never forcing, just guiding the flow in a way that felt almost invisible. And that was what unsettled the room the most. Not a sudden display, not a dramatic moment, but the quiet certainty of someone who was not reacting, but deciding, second by second, movement by movement, until, finally, in a motion so clean it almost seemed to disappear as it happened, the balance shifted completely, and Ethan paused, his body still, his expression frozen for a fraction of a second as realization caught up with him. And then, just as quickly, he tapped, not out of fear, not out of force, but out of recognition, a clear, practiced signal that needed no explanation. And for a moment, no one reacted. No one spoke, because the room had not yet caught up to what had just happened, the silence stretching longer, heavier, until it settled into something undeniable, something that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. And Jason, standing just at the edge of the mat, felt it before anyone else did. That quiet, irreversible shift where expectation collapsed and reality stood in its place without asking for permission. For a moment, time did not move. The kind of stillness that settles in when reality refuses to match expectation. Ethan remained exactly where he was, his hands still slightly raised from the tap, his breathing steady, but his eyes different now. No longer casual, no longer assuming, but clear, present, and fully aware of what had just taken place. And slowly he stepped back, giving space, not out of obligation, but out of respect, a respect that had not existed even 30 seconds earlier. Around them, the students stood frozen, phones lowered without anyone realizing it. The faint smirks that once filled the edges of the room gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, a silence that carried weight, because everyone had seen it, everyone had felt the shift, and no one could pretend otherwise. Jason did not move at first, his posture still, his eyes fixed on the mat where the moment had unfolded, his mind working quickly, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he believed about control, about skill, about who belonged and who did not. And when he finally stepped forward, the sound of his feet against the mat seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every remaining glance back to him. Because now, the focus had shifted again, not away from her, but toward him, toward how he would respond, how he would restore the order that had just been disrupted in front of everyone. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but not close enough to reclaim the authority he once held so easily. His expression composed, but no longer relaxed, and when he spoke, the tone had changed, subtle, but undeniable. That was, he paused for the briefest second, searching for a word that would not undermine him. Unexpected. The word landed softly, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before. Because it was the first acknowledgment that something had gone beyond his control. She met his gaze without challenge, without pride, just steady, calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if this moment was simply another step in a process she understood far better than anyone else in the room. Jason exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because now he needed clarity, and clarity did not come from assumptions. How long have you been training? He asked, and for the first time since she walked in, there was no condescension in his voice, no edge, just a direct question, and the room leaned in again, quieter than before. Waiting, because now the answer mattered, not as a setup, but as a revelation. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question not for accuracy, but for simplicity. Long enough, she replied, her voice even, and a faint ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not disbelief, but something closer to realization, because the answer did not explain anything, and yet, it explained everything. Jason held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped back, not retreating, but yielding just enough to acknowledge what had already been proven. And in that small movement, the hierarchy of the room shifted once more, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that everyone could feel, because respect, once forced to appear, does not ask for permission, it simply takes its place. And as the silence settled again, deeper this time, more grounded, the lesson that had begun with quiet laughter had ended without a single word needing to explain it, leaving only the unmistakable understanding that what they had witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, but something far more precise, something that had been there all along, waiting patiently beneath the surface, until the moment someone decided to underestimate it. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding it too long. A few students glanced at each other, uncertain, as if waiting for someone else to react first, but no one did, because whatever had just happened had quietly rewritten the rules they had been following just minutes ago. Ethan stepped back another pace, his posture no longer squared for demonstration, but relaxed in a different way now, his respect no longer implied, but fully present, and he gave a small nod toward her, not for show, not for anyone else, but because it was earned, and that simple gesture carried more weight than any words spoken earlier. Jason watched it closely, every detail, the nod, the distance, the shift in Ethan's stance, because he understood what it meant. Even if he did not want to fully admit it yet, the authority he had built in this room was not gone, but it had been challenged, quietly, precisely, and without effort. And that kind of challenge did not come often. He cleared his throat lightly, not to fill the silence, but to reclaim some part of the structure that had slipped away. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though the edge of certainty had softened. "Let us reset." It sounded like a command, but it carried less force than before, and the students responded slower this time, their movements hesitant, eyes still drifting back toward her. Because now, she was no longer just someone who had walked in unexpectedly. She had become the center of something they did not yet understand, a reference point they could not ignore. She stepped off the mat as calmly as she had stepped onto it, retrieving her sneakers with the same quiet precision, her expression unchanged, no trace of pride, no need to explain, as if the moment had already passed for her, even while it was still unfolding for everyone else. Jason hesitated, just for a second, then spoke again, this time more direct. "You did not come here by accident," he said. And it was not a question, not anymore. It was an acknowledgment. She looked at him, her eyes steady, and gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "No," she replied simply, and that single word settled into the room with a clarity that no one could dismiss. Because now the story they had created about her, the assumptions, the quiet judgments, the laughter, all of it collapsed under the weight of something real. Something undeniable. A younger student near the edge of the mat shifted awkwardly, lowering his phone completely now, as if realizing that what he thought would be a moment of entertainment had turned into something else entirely, something he was not prepared to capture. Jason took a slow breath, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. Then he straightened, not with the same rigid authority as before, but with something more measured, more aware. "You are welcome to stay," he said, and the words carried a different tone now, not dismissive, not conditional, but genuine, because whatever had just happened had earned that much. At the very least, she considered it briefly, then nodded once, a quiet acceptance. And as she stepped back toward the edge of the room, the space around her shifted without anyone saying a word. Students moved slightly, not dramatically, but enough to create room, to acknowledge her presence in a way they had not before. And Jason, standing at the center of it all, understood something in that moment that could not be undone, that respect, once forced into existence by truth, does not ask permission to remain, it simply stays, reshaping everything around it without ever raising its voice. The class resumed, but it was no longer the same room, the same rhythm, or the same unspoken rules that had existed just minutes earlier. Movements restarted, pairs formed again, instructions continued, yet everything carried a subtle hesitation, a quiet awareness that had not been there before, as if the foundation beneath their certainty had shifted just enough to be felt, but not fully understood. Jason moved through the mat, correcting stances, offering guidance, his voice steady, professional, but those who knew him well could sense the difference. The pauses were slightly longer, the tone slightly more measured, because now, every word carried the weight of being seen, not just heard. And across the room, she stood near the edge, no longer the center of attention, yet impossible to ignore, her presence quiet but grounded, observing once again. But this time, no one mistook it for uncertainty. A younger student approached her hesitantly, his movements unsure, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Ma'am," he began, then paused, correcting himself. Would you mind showing me that step?" His voice carried a mixture of respect and curiosity, the kind that replaces judgment when reality forces it to. She looked at him briefly, her expression calm, then nodded once, stepping forward without hesitation, and as she guided him, her movements were simple, clear, not exaggerated, not performative, just precise, efficient, and easy to follow. And that was when more students began to notice, not because she demanded attention, but because attention naturally shifted toward clarity, toward something that worked without needing explanation. Jason saw it from across the mat, the small circle forming around her, students watching, listening, adjusting their own movements based on her quiet corrections, and for a moment, he did not interrupt, did not step in, because what he was witnessing was not disruption, it was alignment, something deeper than authority, something earned rather than assigned. He walked closer, slowly, observing the interaction, the way she spoke, the way the students responded, the absence of tension, the presence of understanding. And when she finished, stepping back to let the student try again, the improvement was immediate, visible, undeniable. The student's movement smoother, more controlled, and the small nod he gave her carried genuine appreciation, not obligation. Jason stopped a few feet away, watching, then finally spoke, his voice calm, but different now. "You have done this before," he said. And this time, it was not a challenge, not a test, just a statement searching for truth. She looked at him, meeting his gaze with the same steady calm. "A long time ago," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, something that hinted at history, at depth, at experience far beyond what anyone in the room had assumed. And Jason nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but no longer needing to, because the proof was already there, written in every movement, every correction, every silent moment that had reshaped the room. And as the class continued, the laughter that once echoed through the space had been replaced by something quieter, something more grounded, a respect that no longer needed to be announced, because it had already taken root, and the room, without realizing it, had become something different, something better, shaped not by authority alone, but by the quiet presence of someone who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The final minutes of the class moved with a quiet precision that had not existed at the start, every step more intentional, every correction more thoughtful, as if the entire room had recalibrated itself around something unspoken yet fully understood. Jason stood near the center once more, watching his pairs worked through their drills, but his attention drifted again and again toward her, not out of doubt anymore, but out of recognition, because what she had brought into the room was not just skill, it was perspective, and perspective had a way of exposing things that confidence alone could not. Eventually, he stepped forward, raising his hand slightly, and the class slowed, then stopped, the familiar signal that training was coming to an end. Students straightened, adjusting their uniforms, their breathing settling, but their eyes remained alert, aware, present in a way that had not been there before. Jason looked around the room, then back toward her, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that whatever he said next would matter more than anything he had said earlier. "We talk a lot about discipline here," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the mat. "About control, about earning your place." He paused, letting the words settle, then continued. "But today, you all saw something that matters more than any of that." His gaze shifted, not dramatically, but clearly, toward her, and the room followed, silent, attentive. "You saw what happens when experience meets humility." The words landed without force, but with clarity, because no one in that room could argue with what they had witnessed. Jason took a small step closer, not onto the center of the mat this time, but slightly off to the side, shifting the focus away from himself, something he rarely did. "We judged too quickly," he said, and there was no hesitation now, no attempt to soften it, just truth, simple and direct, and the honesty of it changed the air in the room more than any command ever could. A few students lowered their gaze, not out of embarrassment, but out of understanding, because they recognized themselves in that statement, recognized how easily they had followed the same assumptions. She stood quietly, receiving none of it as praise, none of it as apology, just as acknowledgment, the way someone does when they never needed validation in the first place. Jason gave a small nod in her direction, not formal, not exaggerated, just real, and stepped back, allowing the moment to settle on its own. The class began to disperse slowly, students gathering their things, but conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Glances toward her carried respect now, not curiosity, not amusement, just a quiet recognition of something earned. And as she slipped her sneakers back on, preparing to leave the same way she had entered, without announcement, without expectation, a few students stepped aside instinctively, creating space. Not because they were told to, but because they understood, and Jason watched her reach the door, the late afternoon light catching the edge of her silver hair once more, the same way it had when she arrived. But everything else had changed, and as the door opened and closed softly behind her, the room remained still for a second longer than necessary. as if holding on to the lesson before letting it go. Because what had happened was not just about technique, not just about a moment on the mat. It was about something quieter, something lasting, the kind of truth that does not need to be repeated to be remembered. And that day, without a single raised voice, the room learned exactly what respect looks like.